Hi, so my name is Will, and I am a sport and exercise psychologist in training through the BACC Power Route. And this is my talk into my experience of using Think Aloud to help improve coaching practice within an elite level football academy. So, for those of you who aren't aware of what Think Aloud is, it's essentially a reflective tool that's used to capture your thoughts and feelings in action. And this is done by recording your verbalizations. So basically, you record yourself speaking or thinking aloud, describing what's going on in your head, essentially, and then listening back to those recordings and reflecting on them after the event. Um, this basically allows coaches and athletes to get a better understanding of a session as a whole, as opposed to just remembering the key moments of it. So basically, it negates some of the memory biases that we're prone to having just as human beings in general, where we're prone to remembering key moments in situations. So a good example of this, if you're coaching, is you might be delivering a session that's an hour and a half long. The first hour might go really well, might be really strong. You might be really happy with how it goes. But then the last 30 minutes, some stuff goes wrong, maybe not quite to plan. Um, and it ends up being quite a bad 30 minutes of the session that you're not overly happy with. And potentially then using traditional reflection methods or even informally reflecting on the session after the event, you might have quite a negative opinion of the session as a whole and really not be happy with how it's gone. But if you're using Think Aloud in this session, when listening back to the recording, you would get a more accurate representation of the session as a whole. So not only would you be able to then identify what potentially was not working with the end of that session and put a plan in place going forward as to maybe how to fix some of those challenges or issues, but you'd also be able to recognize that the first hour of that session was really strong and be able to pull out the positives of the session, what was working well, what maybe was working well at the start that you weren't doing at the end of the session that might have had an impact, and these kind of factors. So it really allows us to get a really a better understanding and representation of an event as a whole, without our potential biases in regards to what we remember. So those really highs and really lows, it gets that more level, accurate representation or reflection on how a session's gone. One thing just to touch on, and I will touch on it a couple of times throughout because I think it's really key, is that ThinkCloud isn't just describing what's going on. So it's not about talking about what you're seeing, or this player's made a run here, or the space of the session is like this. It's actually explaining your thoughts and your rationales behind why you're delivering what you're doing, or what you're thinking or feeling at that point in time, and how that might be impacting the session. So, for example, when helping to deliver a Think Aloud session or workshop, sorry, to some MSc students, they were being really distracted at the start, which is understandable, and really struggling to kind of go a little bit deeper with their Think Aloud or with their verbalizations. So I explained to them, if I was doing Think Aloud just now or using Think Aloud in the session, I would probably say something along the lines of, "Oh, I don't know these group of athletes. I find it really difficult to coach when I don't know people's names. I don't know the difference in ability levels in these individuals, which is making me feel a little bit nervous, a little bit anxious, and I worry that that might have a bit of a negative impact on the session." So those are the type of verbalizations you really want to try and get to, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, this person's done this. Okay, this person looks like a better player than this person." These type of things. It's really being introspective, for lack of a better term. And before I go on from this, I've deliberately not used academic references or references within this talk, because I wanted to keep it a little bit more applied focused. But if you would like to look into some of the literature around Think Aloud, Dr. Amy Whitehead is the main figure within the literature. So lots of research from her and her use of Think Aloud, particularly with athletes as well as with coaches, and a particular paper that's really useful, which this work was somewhat based off of. It is a paper by Swethington and Whitehead from, I believe, 2021. Fairly recent. I can't remember if it's 21 or 22, so forgive me. But essentially their use of Think Aloud within a coaching academy or with coaches as well, within football, and basically an outline of the theory behind Think Aloud, and also how they structured and ran their Think Aloud protocol. So in front of you there is just basically a really simple example of how Think Aloud works. And that's one thing I really like about Think Aloud and using it in my practice. It's really simple. It's really easy to explain to someone, but it's really hard to master. So there's a lot of development and continuing development and improvement that can come from using Think Aloud, but it's really easy to just give a go straight away. So Think Aloud, as I've already touched on, is simply reflecting in action. So recording your verbalizations. Then you listen back to those recordings and you reflect on actions, so reflect on what's happened. And then you use those reflections and what you found in those reflections to basically analyze what's going on and develop a plan going forward of maybe some things that you want to adapt or change, or some things that you're doing well that you want to continue to do. And then you would continue to use Think Aloud to basically check up on them and basically ensure that you are delivering in the way you want to deliver, and you're working on the things that you want to be working on. So it's not a one and done task. It's something that can be continually done over time. And the more Think Aloud's done, the easier it becomes and the more effective it becomes as well. So in regards to my use of Think Aloud within the academy in which I ran it with the coaching staff that I ran it with, so the way it was ran was different from the way that it was intended to be run. As with many things in the last few years, it was impacted by COVID lockdowns, unfortunately. So it was adapted to be ran online, essentially. So initially, there was an introductory video for coaching staff. This explained to them what Think Aloud was, the benefits it could have, and why they were using it. They were then invited once we knew the start date of training again, the week prior to that start date, they were invited to an online workshop. This basically was, again, another little recap on what Think Aloud is, getting the coaches to basically explain their understanding of it and allow them to ask any questions that they had about the protocol and how it's run. There were also a couple of coaches were then asked to use Think Aloud in the online session. So a video of actually a Liverpool training session was played for them, and they were to act as the coach delivering the session, using Think Aloud to explain what basically, to verbalize what they're saying and the explanations behind that. Not really as effective as if this was to be able to run in person. So if it was to be ran in person, you would allow the coaches each to maybe run a bit of a 5-minute drill with the other coaches and use Think Aloud whilst they're doing that. And that would allow you, as a practitioner delivering it, essentially, the ability to maybe ask any more questions that come out, or to iron out any kinks in regards to potentially being quite descriptive or not using Think Aloud in the way that it's intended. So potentially stopping recordings as opposed to verbalizing the whole time, these type of things. The Think Aloud itself was asked to be used in at least one session per week for a 4 to 6 week period. This was to kind of encourage the coaches to kind of push back that initial, push past, that initial uncomfortableness that you get from Think Aloud, which I'll get onto in a minute as well. And also because the recordings, the verbalizations were getting used for some research as well. And just due to the lockdown delays in regards to when we could start collecting the data, there was some undergraduate and I think postgraduate students as well who were needing the data for dissertations. So just to ensure that they were getting the data that they needed for their assignments as soon as they could, so that they could ensure they were meeting their deadlines. So the coaches' experiences of using Think Aloud then, which is probably the most important part, is initially, majority of them stated that they felt quite uncomfortable using Think Aloud. So the process of talking to yourself and recording it, for a lack of a better term, as simple as that is quite an uncomfortable thing to do. And also becoming more aware of your inner thought process and having to maybe question yourself and explain why you've done things can feel quite uncomfortable and quite challenging at times. But all coaches state that the more they did that, the easier that it became to do. So the more they used Think Aloud, the easier that became, and the more beneficial it was. There was also some incorrect uses of Think Aloud initially, so I already touched on, but there was a coach who was delivering a session and then stepping away to reflect on what they'd done, starting the recording at that point, verbalizing and reflecting, and then stopping the recording and going back to the session. So what they were doing there was still reflecting on action as opposed to inaction, because they were just describing what had gone on as opposed to verbalizing their thought processes as it was unfolding, if that makes sense. So it's really important that when you're using Think Aloud, you don't necessarily need to use it for a full session, but the time period that you're using it for, that microphone is recording that whole time, and that you're using Think Aloud and actively thinking aloud, verbalizing those thoughts and feelings throughout that time period. Again, as I've already touched on a number of times, is those initial recordings and reflections from those coaches were very, very descriptive. So a lot of time spent talking about the shape and the layout of sessions where cones are placed, and the runs players were making, the passes they were making, very descriptive things, stuff that you would be able to see if you were watching the session. So not really getting the positive benefits out of Think Aloud by explaining their thought process and their feelings behind what's going on. But the more they use Think Aloud, and the more that they were prompted and encouraged to do this, the easier that became to do, and the more descriptive and self-reflective coaches became, as opposed to just these initial descriptive sessions. The vast majority of coaches also say that they enjoyed using Think Aloud, despite it being quite uncomfortable to start with, and would continue to use it going forward. So there was a range of part-time and full-time coaches within the academy. Some of the more full-time coaches, with the time allocated to them, said they were quite keen to continue to use Think Aloud to record full sessions, maybe not every week, maybe just once a month or every couple of weeks, and then listen back to those recordings and use the Think Aloud protocol. Others said that just due to time restraints, you might just use it once a month, or maybe just use it for parts of sessions and continue to use it on a regular basis as a tool to continue to improve their coaching practice, but also check in on themselves and ensure they're working in the way that they intend to be working on, and meeting their own personal goals and the kind of club goals that there were at the time as well. So in regards to the benefits that we found from analysing the recordings and getting feedback from the coaches, were firstly an improved self-awareness. So that improved self-awareness is quite expected. It's quite common within the literature. And in regards to the coaches, this was found to be the coaching staff basically becoming more aware of the language and tone they were using to deliver sessions. So, for example, a number of coaches comment on the fact they picked up that they were swearing more than they realized. So not at players, but just in general language. They would use some industrial language as they stated, and they wanted to cut back on that. Another coach also touched on the fact that he was delivering to the reserves in the morning, and then in the afternoon he'd be delivering to potentially an under 13 age group. And before using Think Aloud, he hadn't realized that he was kind of using the same mannerisms and the same coaching style for the reserves and for those younger age groups. And by using Think Aloud, he became aware of some potential negatives that was having. So potentially being a little bit too direct and a little bit too not harsh, but again, I think direct's the best terminology to use there with the younger players, which might be more beneficial and needed for the reserved age players, but for the younger players, a bit more of a soft approach when the coach felt was a better way to deliver to them. Another thing that coaches became aware of was the amount of input that they were giving to players during sessions. By using Think Aloud, a number of coaches would deliver and then have to step back to the Think Aloud process. And in that time, something might have happened which they would normally have jumped in to correct. But they noticed that by taking that step back, that the players a number of the times would be able to fix those issues themselves. And they didn't need as much feedback or as much breakdown to the session as they may have felt they needed before using Think Aloud, which I think was quite interesting. And again, unsurprisingly, with the Think Aloud protocol itself, is the coaches just got a better understanding of their session as a whole, how it was going, the way their language and their tone was impacting and changing throughout sessions, how factors both within and out with football were impacting their delivery. All these things are really beneficial. I also have a couple quotes taken from some of the coaches up there, just some examples of that improved self-awareness, improved emotional intelligence. I won't bother reading through them, but they're there just to kind of help get an understanding of the coaches' perspectives and feelings of how they found using the Think Aloud protocol itself. The next benefit that was suggested to have from the coaching staff and from the analysis was, and it's a bit more novel, a bit more unique in comparison to what's been found in the other Think Aloud literature, is improved emotional intelligence. So coaches basically throughout all stated that they became more aware of how their emotions were impacting sessions, potentially commenting on how when maybe being frustrated in sessions that they were then delivering in a way that they didn't like or weren't happy with and didn't realize that they were delivering in that way. And using Think Aloud as a tool to kind of help them be aware of how they're feeling and how those feelings and emotions were impacting or potentially could impact their delivery and feedback to players. But not just in a negative sense as well. A number of coaches commented on the fact of getting excited and really into a session, and those positive emotions and feelings having a really good positive effect on the session, and really getting the kids to or the younger athletes, sorry, to just buy in and really enjoy the session and have a positive experience, which is really nice to see as well. The Think Aloud process, obviously, it forced those coaches to reflect, and I've already said that, but they really forced the coaches to reflect on those emotions before feeding back to players as well, which I think is really key. So just being aware that maybe if they're frustrated for whatever reason, that could potentially come across in the when they're giving feedback to a player, and that player might respond more negatively to that, or take criticism when criticism or negative criticism as opposed to constructive criticism as it's potentially intended to be. So why do I think that coaches should be using Think Aloud then? So as I've already touched on again, it's simple to use but really hard to master. There's no one here listening to this who can't go away and do Think Aloud just now and give it a go. Again, it might take a bit of time to get to that level of really internal reflection and being really honest and critical with yourself. But you can go away and give it a go, and listen back to it and see how you maybe you're more descriptive than you realized, or how your tone's impacting sessions, these type of things. And with it being hard to master, if you're aware of skill acquisition theory, really positive to be able to almost see your advancement with Think Aloud of if you use it over a 6-month period, 3-month period, and you go back and you listen to some of those earlier reflections to the or verbalizations compared to your more recent ones, just seeing how potentially much more detailed those descriptions are and beneficial they are, can be a really positive and encouraging experience. Obviously, it'll help you gain a better insight to your sessions and your coaching style as a whole, and become aware of some things that you maybe aren't overly aware of, such as the way you're delivering, or the ensuring that you're delivering in the way that you're intending to. Obviously, as we've touched on again, it'll help improve that self-awareness, which I think is really important, and also that emotional intelligence, which I think, particularly within football settings, I think we're all quite bad at recognizing our emotions and understanding the impacts that they have. So for me, anything within these settings that's helping people become more aware of their emotions and how that's impacting the sessions, delivery, their performance as an athlete, as a coach, is a really useful and beneficial skill. Think Aloud also helps you not only identify areas for improvement or things that might not be working as well as you want to, but also helps you identify your strengths as a coach. And I think that's really key. I think it's something we don't do enough of, is we're the first people to go back and, okay, this needs to be better, this needs to be better. But how often do we go back and think, oh, that was good, this was good, I want to continue to do this? And probably not as much as we should. And Think Aloud really allows you to do that. And I think it's a really positive component and aspect of it. And Think Aloud itself is also a really useful coach assessment tool. So not only potentially sharing your Think Aloud recordings to another coach for feedback on it, if that's what you think is useful, but if you're observing a coach and providing feedback to them on their session, using Think Aloud in that process, and not only like saying what you think might be beneficial or what's been going well or what could be changed, using Think Aloud to verbalize and explain your thought process behind that can be really useful, not only for yourself, but also for the coach that's potentially getting that feedback, to understand the reasons and the rationale behind the feedback that you're giving them. And then finally, just some limitations in regards to using Think Aloud, and just some stuff to be aware of if you're going to go and give it a go. Firstly, is be aware of the recording device you're using and the mic placement. So a lot of people use a mobile phone to record. Make sure you've got the recording software on the phone and that it works. And make sure you test it out before you go and give Think Aloud a go. If you're using an AirPod, an earphone, anything like that to record the session or your verbalizations, be aware that that might limit your hearing, for instance, out of one ear, which can potentially have a negative impact. And also, if you have a clip-on microphone, making sure that it's not firstly too close to your mic, to your mouth, so that if you are shouting or getting a bit more vocal, that it's clipping and you're not catching what's being said. And also that it's not underneath any items of clothing or anywhere that it's going to rustle against any clothing or anything else, for lack of a better term, against the zip. Anything that's going to make it harder to listen back to those recordings and collect the data or those verbalizations. Think Aloud itself can be a really time-consuming task, and I think for me that's one of the unfortunate limitations of it is the time it takes to listen back to a recording, analyze it, and put it into practice going forward. But I do think that is really it is a really useful task. One really good way around that is don't feel you need to use it for full sessions. Potentially just using it for for a specific amount of time, 30 minutes of a session, or during a specific drill you're wanting to work on, is a really useful way to use Think Aloud. And again, as I've touched on already a number of times, is Think Aloud can feel really uncomfortable, but the more you use it, the easier it becomes. And pushing through that initial discomfort and becoming aware of why that's uncomfortable even is a really useful thing. So there's a term that I think is quite common within applied sports psychology, is that discomfort or uncomfortableness can be a positive as long as it's done in the right way. And I think Aloud does it in the right way. And by feeling uncomfortable to start with, I think that's a really positive thing. Almost shows you're doing it right. That doesn't mean that if you're feeling comfortable using it, that you're not doing it right. But feeling discomfort, being aware of that discomfort, and then continuing to use it and becoming more and more comfortable with it, and then comparing those recordings is really useful just to help see your development and your advancement in using Think Aloud itself. And obviously, not only thinking aloud can be quite challenging, but just reflecting in general can be quite a hard thing to do. Questioning yourself, being honest with yourself, admitting not only when you feel that you're not doing something right or in the way you want to do it, but also recognizing when you're doing things well can be quite an uncomfortable thing. But try using potentially a reflective framework. Gibbs is quite a common one out there. Feel free to use any one that you like, or even potentially make your own. But by using a structured reflective tool, it will make these reflections easier, ensure you're analyzing and answering the questions you want to, and getting as much out of the time you've spent recording these sessions and listening back to them as possible. And thanks so much for taking your time to listen to my talk. If they do have any questions around Think Aloud, or my use of it, or anything else, feel free to get in touch at any point.